The gavel came down so hard it cracked the edge of the long oak table, and every soul packed into the Dry Creek County Courthouse fell absolutely silent. Matthew Warren stood at the front of that room like he owned every board of the floor beneath his boots, his dark eyes sweeping the assembled ranchers, farmers, and county officials with the cold, practiced authority of a man who had never once walked out of a negotiation without what he came for. He was 32 years old, broad across the shoulders, weathered in the way that only years of frontier sun and hard living could weather a man, and he had just spent 45 minutes dismantling every argument the small farming community along the Rio Seco tributary had ever dared to raise against the massive Warren Ranch water claim. The silence in that room was not respect. It was defeat. Judge Harlan Potts wiped sweat from his forehead and shuffled the papers before him, refusing to meet the eyes of the farmers crowded into the gallery benches. Commissioner Dale Eckhart, the one man on the three-person water rights panel who had a known financial interest in keeping the big ranches happy, leaned back in his chair with the satisfied expression of a man watching a prize bull perform exactly as expected. Matthew had done what he always did. He had arrived with legal filings, survey maps, recorded deed histories going back 15 years, signed affidavits from 2 county engineers, and the kind of deep, unhurried voice that made even questionable arguments sound like geological fact. He had cited the Colorado doctrine of prior appropriation with such fluency that 2 members of the panel had nodded along as though he were reading scripture. He had made the small farmers sound like opportunists, like latecomers, like people with soft hands and soft claims trying to carve pieces from something that was never theirs to begin with. He had been, by every measure anyone watching could use, unstoppable. And then the bailiff called the next name, Catherine Baker. Representing the Baker Farm and the Rio Seco Smallholder Association, Matthew did not sit down right away. He stood for just a moment longer than he needed to, straightening the papers in his hand, and he looked toward the door through which this Catherine Baker was now walking, expecting to see the kind of tired, slightly overwhelmed face he had learned to expect from opponents who came after him in these rooms. He expected the slight tremor in the voice, the deference, the involuntary softening that happened when ordinary people found themselves standing where he had just been standing. He did not expect her. Catherine Baker was 28 years old, and she walked into that courtroom like she had built it with her own hands and had simply been away for a few years. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself with a particular quality of stillness that made her seem to fill the space around her. She wore a plain brown dress that had been carefully pressed, her dark auburn hair pinned back with a practicality that somehow made her look more formidable than any amount of finery might have managed. She carried a leather satchel that was clearly heavy, and she set it down on the presenting table with a calm, deliberate thunk that echoed in the hushed room. She did not look at Matthew Warren. That was the first thing that surprised him. Every other opponent had looked at him, some with fear, some with resentment, some with the desperate hope that he might have made some visible error they could exploit. Catherine Baker set up her materials with focused, quiet efficiency, and Matthew Warren did not exist in her peripheral vision at all. The second thing that surprised him happened 3 minutes after she began speaking. She destroyed him. Not with anger, not with rhetoric, not with any of the emotional appeals that he had learned to deflect with the ease of long practice. She did it with water. Specifically, with a hydrological survey of the Rio Seco tributary conducted by a doctor, Elias Greaves of the New Mexico Territorial Water Commission, which Catherine Baker had apparently commissioned 8 months ago, and which documented, with the dispassionate authority of science, that the Warren Ranch's upstream diversion practices had already reduced the Rio Seco's flow to the smallholder farms by 43% over the previous decade. She had affidavits from 3 neighboring counties showing similar patterns of large ranch upstream diversion destroying downstream small farm viability. She had the original territorial charter establishing the Rio Seco tributary as a shared community resource, with explicit downstream access protections written in 1869. And she had, perhaps most devastatingly, a letter from the United States Department of the Interior dated just 6 weeks prior, acknowledging receipt of her formal complaint and indicating that federal oversight of the water allocation in question was under active review. She spoke for 50 minutes. Her voice did not tremble once. When she was finished, Judge Potts sat very still for a long moment, and Commissioner Eckhart had stopped leaning back in his chair. Matthew Warren had not moved from the seat he finally taken when she began. He had intended to leave. He had pressing things to attend to. The negotiation was as good as finished. His claim was the strongest in the room. But some quality in her voice had made him stay, and now he sat with the strange, vertiginous sensation of a man who has been absolutely certain of the ground beneath his feet, and has just been shown a very accurate map proving it is not ground at all, but ice. The panel called a recess. In the corridor outside the courtroom, with the noise of a dozen anxious conversations filling the narrow space, Matthew Warren moved through the crowd until he was standing directly in Catherine Baker's path, and she finally looked at him. Her eyes were green. He registered that with a strange, irrelevant clarity. "That Federal Review letter," he said, keeping his voice low and level. "That was filed before this hearing was scheduled. 8 weeks before," she confirmed, and her voice was perfectly steady. "You have been building this case for the better part of a year." "I have been building this case," Catherine Baker said, "since the winter my neighbor Thomas Aldridge lost his entire wheat crop because your upstream diversion gates were left open for 6 consecutive weeks during the dry season, and he could not make his bank payment, and he had to sell the farm his father built to pay his debts. That was 3 years ago. So no, not a year, 3 years." The silence between them lasted exactly 4 seconds. Matthew counted them without meaning to. "I didn't know about Aldridge," he said. "I know you didn't." Something shifted in her expression, not softer exactly, but more precise. "That is part of the problem, Mr. Warren. You have never had to know." She moved past him, and he did not stop her. The panel issued a preliminary ruling 2 hours later. They declined to grant the Warren Ranch's expanded diversion claim pending further review. They issued an emergency protection order for the smallholder downstream access rights. And they formally forwarded the hearing record to the Federal Review Office in Santa Fe. Matthew Warren rode home to the Warren Ranch with the preliminary ruling folded in his coat pocket and the image of green eyes and deliberate calm sitting in his chest like an ember that did not quite go out. That had been October of 1882. He had not spoken to her again in 4 months. But the story, the real story, had started long before that courtroom, and it did not end there either. It had roots that went down as deep as the water table under the cracked red earth of Dry Creek County, New Mexico Territory, and it would take considerably more than one hearing to either resolve it or to burn it to the ground. The Warren Ranch had been built by Matthew's father, James Warren, who had come west from Tennessee in 1861, and had accumulated land with the particular ruthless intelligence of a man who understood early that in the West, land meant nothing without water, and water meant everything. By the time James Warren died of a heart attack in 1877, the Warren Ranch encompassed 14,000 acres, controlled 3 water diversion points on the Rio Seco tributary, and was the single most economically significant privately held operation in Dry Creek County. Matthew had inherited everything at the age of 27. He had also inherited the ranching foreman, Hector Reyes, who had worked the Warren land for 15 years and who knew more about the practical operations of the ranch than Matthew had ever been required to learn. He had inherited the legal arrangement with the firm of Goddard and Pierce in Santa Fe, who handled the Warren Ranch's property interests with the aggressive competence of men paid very well to be aggressive and competent. And he had inherited a way of existing in Dry Creek County that was, he had been raised to understand, simply the correct way for the Warrens to exist. What he had not inherited was any particular desire to question any of this. He was not a cruel man. He understood this about himself with the same matter-of-fact accuracy that he applied to survey maps and deed records. He did not set out to harm small farmers. He had simply been raised inside a worldview so large and self-contained that the small farmers had always been, at most, a feature of the landscape, rather than people with names and crop failures and bank payments due. Thomas Aldridge's farm was something he had never heard of until Catherine Baker said the man's name in a courthouse corridor. That bothered him more than the preliminary ruling. Catherine Baker had come to Dry Creek County in 1878, the year after James Warren died, though she had not known James Warren and could not have said whether his death was related to anything in her own history. She had come because her father, William Baker, had died of typhoid in Albuquerque in the spring of that year, and because the farm he had operated on the Rio Seco tributary since 1872 had no one left to operate it but Catherine and her younger brother, Daniel, who was 19 and willing, but not yet steady enough to be left in charge alone. Catherine had been 24 years old when she assumed management of the Baker farm. She had been educated at a small school in Albuquerque. She could read and cipher well, and she had spent enough summers helping her father that she understood irrigation and crop rotation, and the particular demands of trying to farm in semi-arid territory that depended on managed water access for everything. She had not been prepared for grief, for the loneliness of the long frontier winters, for the way that problems on a small farm accumulated the way debt accumulated, each one manageable in isolation, collectively capable of drowning a person entirely. But she had also not been prepared for how much she was capable of, and the discovery of that had been, over 4 years, the organizing principle of her life. The Rio Seco Smallholder Association had been her idea in the winter of 1880, when she had realized that the 6 small farms along the lower tributary were each facing versions of the same problem in isolation, and that the only way any of them were going to survive was to stop facing it alone. She had ridden to each farm herself, in weather that had no business being ridden in, and had sat at 6 different kitchen tables, and listened to 6 different variations of the same quiet desperation, and had proposed that they pool their legal concerns and their evidence and their collective voice into something that a single county water rights panel would have a much harder time ignoring than any one of them individually. She had been right. She had also been, in the process, transformed into something she had not started out as. She had started out as a farmer's daughter trying to save her family's land. By 1882, she was the person every small farmer along the lower Rio Seco came to when something went wrong, which meant she had, by necessity, become the person who knew how to make things go right. She had taught herself property law from borrowed books. She had corresponded with the Territorial Water Commission. She had written letters to federal offices in Santa Fe and Washington that were precise, documented, and impossible to ignore. She had built a case the way a person builds a stone wall, one carefully placed piece at a time, over years, until the whole structure was capable of holding weight that would have crushed a hastily constructed thing entirely. The Federal Review letter had not been luck. It had been the result of 14 months of patient, documented correspondence with a civil servant in Santa Fe named Mr. Theodore Marsh, who had initially ignored her, then responded with polite bureaucratic deflection, then found himself in possession of a level of documented evidence that made continued deflection professionally dangerous. Catherine Baker had not threatened Mr. Theodore Marsh. She had simply continued to provide him with accurate information in well-organized documents until doing nothing had become the more complicated option. This was, Matthew Warren would eventually come to understand, essentially how Catherine Baker operated in all areas of her life. She did not force anything. She simply built the conditions under which the correct outcome became the path of least resistance, and then she was very patient, and then she waited. He did not understand this in October 1882. He understood it fully by the following summer, but the understanding came at a cost that neither of them had anticipated. The 4 months between the hearing and the moment their stories crossed again were not quiet months. The preliminary ruling had sent a tremor through the ranching community of Dry Creek County, and ranchers who had water rights claims pending or contemplated found themselves suddenly aware that the comfortable, well-worn machinery of county hearings could apparently be interrupted by well-documented federal complaints. There was a meeting at the Dry Creek Cattlemen's Association that Matthew attended and wished he had not, because it turned into an extended exercise in collective resentment directed at Catherine Baker, and Matthew found himself sitting very still and not contributing to any of it, which was noticed. Gerald Holt, who ran the second largest ranch in the county and who had what could most charitably be described as a transactional approach to truth, said flatly that the Baker woman had manipulated the process, that her federal letter was a manufactured delay tactic, and that if the Cattlemen's Association did not organize a coordinated legal response immediately, they would find themselves picked apart one by one. Matthew said nothing. He was thinking about Thomas Aldridge's farm. He had, after the hearing, quietly asked Hector Reyes about the winter when the upstream diversion gates had been left open for 6 consecutive weeks. Hector had been quiet for a long moment and then had said simply that there had been issues with the north fence line that season, that the ranch hands had been focused there, and that the gates had not been checked with the frequency they should have been. Did anyone know the downstream farms were affected? Matthew had asked. Hector had looked at him with the expression of a man who has known the answer to a question for years and has been waiting to see whether the question would ever be asked. Thomas Aldridge came to the ranch house, Hector said. He came twice. Your father spoke with him the first time. After the second time, your father spoke with the lawyer in Santa Fe. Matthew had walked away from that conversation and had stood for a long time looking out over the 14,000 acres his father had built and left him, and he had felt something shifting in his understanding of himself and where he stood, the way ground shifts before an earthquake when the pressure has been building for a long time beneath the surface. He had not acted on this feeling immediately. It was too large, too implicating, and he was not yet ready to know what acting on it would require. It was February of 1883 when they met again, and it happened because of a frozen water pipe and a broken wagon wheel, and the particular stubbornness of a New Mexico winter that had no interest in human inconvenience. Catherine had been driving her small supply wagon back from the town of Dry Creek when a wheel had fractured on the frozen ruts of the South Road, 3 miles from her farm and 1 mile from the edge of Warren Ranch land. The temperature had dropped so sharply in the preceding hour that her breath came in solid clouds, and the horse, a steady bay mare named Annie, was unhappy in the way that horses become unhappy when the cold moves past discomfort into actual threat. Matthew had been riding the fence line of the south pasture because one of his ranch hands had reported ice damage to a section of fencing, and he had wanted to assess it personally. He had come around the low rise and seen the tilted wagon and the woman standing beside it in the failing afternoon light, and he had stopped his horse and looked at this for a moment before riding forward. She looked up at the sound of hooves and recognized him, and the thing that happened on her face was interesting, because it was not the resentment or the guarded hostility he had half expected. It was something more complicated. It was the expression of a person recalibrating a situation based on new information. "Mr. Warren," she said, "Miss Baker." He dismounted and walked his horse to the wagon, looking at the wheel. "The iron rim is cracked all the way through. You won't make it another mile on this. I'm aware. How long have you been here?" "About 20 minutes. He looked at the sky, which had the particular gray-blue color of a sky that was considering doing something worse, and then looked at the road, which was empty in both directions. "My ranch is a mile east," he said. "You should come in until this passes and we can see about getting your wagon properly dealt with." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved across the open ground with the purposeful cold of February in New Mexico territory. "That's generous of you," she said, and her voice carried the faint edge of something that was not quite irony, but acknowledged the strangeness of the situation. "It's practical," he said. "The temperature is going to drop another 10 degrees before dark." They left the wagon where it was, with a tarpaulin secured over the supplies and a marker stake so it could be found easily. Catherine rode Annie and Matthew rode his horse, and they went east along the fence line in near silence, with the cold pressing down on the open land around them, and the Warren Ranch house eventually appearing in the distance like a lamp in a dark room. The Warren Ranch house was larger than anything along the lower Rio Seco tributary, built of adobe and timber with a deep covered porch running the full length of the front face. And inside it was warmer than the outside world had any right to make anything, with a stone fireplace in the main room that Hector Reyes had, with evident relief at the sight of them, immediately stoked to a serious height. Hector was not a man who showed surprise often, but the presence of Catherine Baker in the Warren Ranch main room clearly registered as something outside the ordinary range of his expectations. He recovered quickly and busied himself with getting coffee and pulling the kitchen table's best chair toward the warmth. Matthew had expected the awkwardness of the situation to be difficult, and it was, but not in the way he had expected. It was difficult because, sitting across a kitchen table from Catherine Baker, with the hearing at a safe distance and no panel or gallery or legal performance required from either of them, he discovered that she was a person he found himself wanting to understand. She asked about the ranch. Specifically and practically, she asked about the water management system, the diversion gates, the seasonal patterns. Not in an adversarial way, not with the precise legal intent of her courtroom manner, but with the genuine curiosity of someone who knew a great deal about a related subject and was interested in the details she hadn't seen from her side. He answered her honestly. More honestly, he realized as he was doing it, than he had answered some of these questions in the hearing room, because in the hearing room the purpose of every answer was to win, and sitting here by a fire in February with the wind outside and a cracked wagon wheel between them, he was not performing anything. He told her about the gates and what Hector had told him about the winter they had been left open. She was very still when he said this. "Your father knew," she said. Not an accusation. A statement of established fact. "Yes." The fire moved in the grate. Outside, snow had begun. "Thomas Aldridge's daughter still lives in the county," Catherine said. "She is 12 years old. She lives with her mother's sister in Dry Creek. Her mother died of a fever the winter after the farm was sold." Matthew looked at the fire for a moment. He felt the weight of this information settling through him with the particular gravity of something that could not be set down again once picked up. "I didn't know that either," he said. "I know. You keep saying that. Because it keeps being true." She looked at him with those green eyes that were direct in a way he had stopped trying to look away from. "You are not a bad man, Mr. Warren. I have never thought you were a bad man. A bad man is much simpler than what you are. What you are is a man who has been inside a very large arrangement for so long that you stopped seeing its edges." He did not argue with this. He was not sure he could have, even if he had wanted to. The snow kept the road impassable until the following morning, which meant Catherine Baker spent the night at the Warren Ranch, in the guest room that was kept clean and ready with the automatic preparedness of a large household that expected occasional necessity. Hector's wife Maria, who managed the household with the quiet authority of a woman who had been doing so for 12 years, produced a supper from the kitchen that was considerably better than the circumstances required. They ate together at the large kitchen table, Matthew and Catherine and Hector and Maria, and it was the strangest meal Matthew Warren could ever remember eating, because it was entirely ordinary in its surface and entirely extraordinary in what was moving underneath it. Across from him sat the woman who had defeated him in the most public and consequential hearing of his professional life, and she was talking to Maria about preserving methods for winter vegetables with the focused interest of someone who actually wanted to know, and he kept finding himself watching her with the particular attention a person gives something they are trying to understand. After supper, while Maria cleared the table and Hector went to check the horses, Matthew and Catherine moved to the main room and the fire, and they talked for 2 hours more. About the land, about the tributary, about what small farming in Dry Creek County actually looked like in practice versus what it looked like on a county map, about what the Warren Ranch actually looked like in practice versus the abstraction of a legal filing, about their fathers, a subject they arrived at carefully from different directions. Her father had loved the Rio Seco. She said this simply, looking at the fire. He had come west because Tennessee had not offered what he needed, and he had found in the work of building water management and growing things in difficult soil a deep, daily satisfaction that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the specific, irreplaceable pleasure of coaxing life from resistant ground. He would have found this year's hearing very satisfying, Catherine said, and the shadow of grief on her face was brief and self-contained, the grief of someone who has been carrying it long enough that it no longer ambushes them. Matthew thought about what to say. He settled on something true. My father would have found it infuriating, he said, and he would have been wrong. She looked at him with something that was not quite surprise. That is a significant thing for you to say, she said. I know. She smiled then for the first time, and it changed her face in a way that did something to his capacity for measured, strategic thinking. It was not a calculated smile or a social smile. It was the sudden, unguarded smile of a person who has heard something genuine and has responded with something genuine in return, and it lasted about 3 seconds before she pulled it back to a more neutral expression. But Matthew had seen it, and he could not unsee it, and he was quite certain he did not want to. The next morning, the road was passable. Hector hitched a ranch horse to the supply wagon and drove it back to the Baker farm with Catherine driving Annie alongside. Matthew rode with them as far as the Warren Ranch boundary and stopped there, watching them go, with the feeling that something had started that he did not have a map for and was not sure he wanted one. Spring arrived in Dry Creek County with the decisive efficiency of a season that has been delayed and means to make up for lost time. The Rio Seco ran higher than it had in several years due to a strong snowmelt in the mountains to the north, and this was good news for every farm along the tributary, though the water rights question was still formally unresolved and the federal review was still pending. Matthew had done something in March that surprised everyone who knew him, including himself. He had written to the Rio Seco Smallholder Association. The letter was brief and formal, and did not explain itself with any more than the minimum necessary words. It stated that the Warren Ranch was prepared to voluntarily modify its upstream diversion schedule during the dry season months to ensure adequate downstream flow to the smallholder farms pending final resolution of the water rights claim, and that this modification was being offered in good faith and did not constitute a legal concession of any kind, and that it would take effect immediately. Catherine had read this letter 3 times before she showed it to anyone else. She had then shown it to Daniel, who was 23 now and had grown into the kind of steady, thoughtful young man their father would have recognized in himself, and Daniel had said, "What does this mean?" And Catherine had said, "I think it means he has been doing some thinking." She had written back, also briefly, also formally. She thanked him on behalf of the association. She noted that the modification would be material to the spring planting season. She said that she would monitor the downstream flow measurements and maintain records that would be of use to the federal review. She did not say anything personal, but she had read the letter 3 times. Matthew had found himself in April writing, The south fence line again. He had told himself this was because of the spring fence inspection, which was legitimate, and not because the south fence line was the section nearest to the Baker farm, which was also legitimate but more complicated. He had not seen Catherine since the February morning when she had ridden away from his ranch house in the winter light, and he was operating on the general principle that he would not seek her out, because seeking her out would be a thing he did not have a good rationale for. He was on the south fence line when he saw her. She was working on the Baker Farm's irrigation channel, the one that ran along the eastern edge of her wheat field, and she was doing this with the sleeves of her work dress rolled to the elbows and a small spade, and the complete, unself-conscious absorption of a person doing a necessary job well. She did not see him for several minutes, and he did not announce himself, not because he was hiding, but because there was something in watching her work that held him in place in the way that certain things do when they have a quality you are trying to identify. She finally looked up and saw him sitting his horse along the fence line, and she straightened and looked at him across the distance between them, and then she lifted one hand in a brief, unceremonious wave. He crossed to the gate and rode through it and dismounted at the edge of her field. "The channel is running well," he said. This was true. "Better than last year," she confirmed. "Your diversion modification made a measurable difference." "Good." They stood there for a moment with the spring sun warm on the field around them and the sound of water moving in the newly cleared channel. "I owe you an apology," Matthew said. She waited. "Not on behalf of the ranch or the legal position or anything that a lawyer would recognize. Personally, for what my father did to Thomas Aldridge and for the fact that I knew nothing about it. I should have known. I was the one in charge." "You had been in charge for 5 years," she said carefully. "That was long enough to know." She looked at him for a long moment with those evaluating, direct eyes, and he had the feeling of being measured with an instrument considerably more accurate than the ones he was accustomed to encountering. "The apology is accepted," she said. "What will you do about it?" He had expected the acceptance and had not expected the follow-up question, which was, he realized, quintessentially Catherine Baker. "I'm going to find out what state Aldridge's daughter is in," he said, "and I'm going to do something about it. What that is will depend on what she needs." Catherine was quiet. The water ran in the channel. A meadowlark somewhere in the field behind them announced the morning. "Her name is Eliza," Catherine said. "She is a serious child. She reads well. She has some difficulty at school because of the other children, which I think has to do with how the farm sale happened and what people's memories are like. Her aunt is a good woman but has very little." He absorbed this. "How do you know all of this?" "Because I want to find out," she said simply. He looked at her in the spring morning and felt something very specific and very large moving through the geography of his chest. He recognized it with the same dispassionate accuracy he brought to everything else, and then immediately found that accuracy entirely insufficient for what the recognition required. He was in love with her. Or the beginning of it, which is sometimes more accurate to call it. The moment you recognize that the path you are on leads somewhere you did not plan to go, and the recognition is not alarm but something closer to relief, as though you have been traveling in the wrong direction for a long time and have suddenly found your compass is working again. He did not say this. It was April, and they were standing in her wheat field, and he had only recently stopped being her legal adversary in a formal sense, and there were approximately 10,000 reasons why saying this would be the wrong thing. "Miss Baker," he said instead, "I wonder if you would be willing to have dinner with me." Not as a negotiation and not as a courtesy. As two people who seemed to find each other's company more interesting than I, for one, would have predicted 6 months ago. The thing that happened on her face was not the smile from the February firelight, but something more cautious than that, more aware, more situated in the reality of their specific history. "The Federal Review is still pending," she said. "I know. People will have opinions. I know. I am not a woman who changes her position on things because of her personal situation," she said, very clearly. "I know," he said. That is one of the things I find most interesting about you." She looked at him for what felt like a significant period of time and was probably about 6 seconds. "Next Saturday," she said, "there is a supper at the Dry Creek Methodist Church Hall. It is public and appropriate, and I will be attending regardless. You could be there." "I could," he said. "6 o'clock," she said, and turned back to her irrigation channel. He remounted his horse and rode back toward the Warren Ranch boundary, and he was aware, with the particular sensitivity of a man who has just had his world rearranged by an irrigation channel, that she waited until he was well away before allowing herself a small, private smile that he could not see. He did not see it, but he might have guessed it was there. The Methodist church supper was, as Catherine had noted, entirely public and appropriately chaperoned by the collective presence of approximately 60 Dry Creek County residents, a preacher, and a very effective potluck that produced 3 separate kinds of pie. Matthew arrived at 6 o'clock exactly and found Catherine already there, talking to the wife of a neighboring small farmer, wearing a deep green dress that made her eyes look like the color of the Rio Seco in spring flood. He brought her a plate of supper, and they found a corner of the church hall where the conversation could be moderately private, and they talked for 3 hours while around them, the social life of Dry Creek County proceeded with the cheerful indifference to anyone's personal drama that characterizes communities too busy with their own concerns to pay sustained attention to other people's. Several people noticed. Several people had opinions. Gerald Holt of the Cattlemen's Association heard about it the following Monday and said something uncharitable at the Dry Creek Saloon that was reported back to Matthew by a ranch hand who had been in the saloon at the time. Matthew sent word to Gerald Holt that he would appreciate it if Gerald concerned himself with his own supper arrangements and left other people's alone. Gerald did not send word back, but he was quiet on the subject thereafter. What Matthew and Catherine talked about at the church supper, and afterward through a series of visits that proceeded with the careful, somewhat formal progress of 2 people who are each accustomed to proceeding carefully, was everything. The land, the water, the law, their fathers, their own histories and the ways they had been shaped by those histories, and the ways they had chosen, deliberately or by necessity, to differ from those shapes. Books. Specific, argued over books, because Catherine read widely and had opinions about what she read that were not opinions designed to agree with the opinions of whoever she was talking to. He rode to the Baker farm on a Sunday afternoon in late May and found her in her vegetable garden, and they sat on the porch steps in the evening sun and talked until the light was gone, and Daniel came out to observe that it was getting dark, and offered Matthew coffee with the studied casualness of a younger brother performing neutrality. He started riding south on Sunday afternoons as a matter that had become, without formal declaration, part of his week. In June, he found Eliza Aldridge. He went a Dry Creek and found the aunt, a Mrs. Ruth Cummer, in a small, scrupulously maintained house on the edge of town, and he introduced himself with the clear understanding that Mrs. Cummer's initial response to his name was not warm. He had expected this and had prepared for it not with legal arguments but with a simple, stated acknowledgement of what his family's operation had contributed to the Aldridges' situation, and a proposal that he set up a small monthly fund for Eliza's support and schooling. No conditions, no legal arrangements, nothing that required anything of Mrs. Cummer or Eliza in return. Mrs. Cummer looked at him for a long time and said she would have to think about it. He said he would come back. He came back 3 times before Mrs. Cummer agreed, and by the 3rd visit, Eliza herself had appeared, a quiet, observant 12-year-old with her father's dark eyes, and she had looked at Matthew with the forthright assessment of a child who has had reason to develop a serious relationship with the question of who in the world can be trusted. He had sat at Ruth Cummer's kitchen table and answered Eliza's questions, which were pointed and specific, and had not talked around any of them. He told Catherine about all 3 visits, in detail, on the Sunday afternoon after the final one. They were sitting on the porch steps of the Baker farm in the July heat, and she listened to the whole account without interrupting, and when he was finished she was quiet for a moment. "You went back 3 times," she said. "It took 3 times. A lot of men would have considered themselves done after the first one." "I know." He looked out at the wheat field, which was green and full and running right to the horizon. "I didn't want to be the person who considers himself done after the first one." She turned and looked at him, and the thing on her face was the unguarded thing, the real thing, the thing he had first seen in a firelight in February and had been trying to see again ever since, and it was there now in full daylight, and it was not a small thing at all. He reached over and took her hand. She looked down at their hands and then back up at him, and she did not take her hand back. "Matthew," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. "Catherine," he said. "This is complicated." "Yes. The federal review is still pending. There will be a final ruling. The positions of the ranch and the association may still be in direct conflict." "I know." He did not let go of her hand. "I want to tell you something, and I want you to hear it as the truth and not as a negotiating position. I have been going over the original Warren Ranch water rights claims for the past 3 months with a lawyer in Santa Fe who is not Gerald Holt's lawyer or any of the Cattlemen's Association lawyers. And I believe that the smallholder downstream protections that were established in the 1869 Charter are legally valid, that my father's diversion practices violated them, and that the correct resolution of the federal review is not the one that is best for the Warren Ranch." She was completely still. "That," she said carefully, "is an extraordinary thing for you to say. I know. If you testify to that position in the federal review, you will lose significant water rights. Probably. Your ranching operation will have to change." "Yes," he looked at her directly. "The question is what kind of man I want to be. I have been asking it since October, and I have a clearer answer now than I had then." Catherine Baker looked at Matthew Warren in the July afternoon sun, with the wheat field running green behind him, and the Rio Seco somewhere beyond the far fence line carrying its contested water toward all the people who depended on it. And she felt the particular sensation of something she had been careful about for a long time beginning, with her full and deliberate consent, to be less careful. "I think," she said quietly, "that you are going to be someone I find it very difficult to stop caring about." "That is my intention," he said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh, a full, genuine sound, and it was extraordinary, and he filed it away with the smile from the firelight and the green eyes and the way she had said his name. In the particular archive a person builds of the moments they understand will matter for the rest of their life. The Federal Review came to a final determination in September of 1883. Matthew had provided a voluntary written statement of his family's historical diversion practices and their effects on downstream farms, prepared with the Santa Fe lawyer he had hired independently of the Cattlemen's Association. The statement was detailed, factually accurate, and damaging to the Warren Ranch's claimed water rights in the most legally relevant ways. His lawyer had tried to talk him out of submitting it. Matthew had thanked the lawyer for his concern and submitted it anyway. The final ruling from the United States Department of the Interior came through on the 14th of September. It established the downstream smallholder access rights as legally protected under the 1869 Charter. It set maximum upstream diversion limits that permanently reduced what the Warren Ranch could take from the Rio Seco. It ordered a modest financial remedy to several downstream farms for documented losses over the preceding decade, a sum that would come substantially from the Warren Ranch. Catherine Baker read the ruling at her kitchen table with Daniel sitting across from her and her hands entirely steady on the paper. "We won," Daniel said. "Yes," she said. "Are you happy?" She thought about this, which was itself an unusual thing for someone who had just received a ruling they had worked 3 years to obtain. "Yes," she said again, "though it is more complicated than happy, and I suspect it will take me some time to understand all of what it is." Matthew received the ruling at the Warren Ranch and read it with Hector Reyes standing at his shoulder. He had expected to feel something when it came, and what he felt was complicated and not unpleasant. There was loss in it, practical and financial loss, the contraction of something his father had built. And there was something else, a quality of rightness, like a physical weight he had been carrying, not even fully aware of, being lifted from the place it had pressed. He saddled his horse and rode to the Baker farm. Catherine came out onto the porch when she heard him coming, and they looked at each other across the yard in the September afternoon. "The ruling came," she said. "I know." "You did something remarkable," she said. "That statement you submitted, you did not have to do that." "I did," he said. "I had to do it for Eliza Aldridge, and for Thomas, and for all the others." He dismounted. "And I had to do it because I am trying to be the person I described to you in July, and I did not see any other way." She came down the porch steps and crossed the yard to him, and when she was close enough that they were standing in the space that in the previous months had remained, by mutual unspoken accord, a space with room for caution, she stopped and looked up at him. "I have something to tell you," she said. "Tell me." "I have been trying to be measured about this," she said. "I have been trying to account for the legal situation and the community circumstances and the various practical reasons why moving slowly was the intelligent approach. And the ruling came today, and it is finished, and there are no more practical reasons in the way." He waited. "I love you," Catherine Baker said, with the directness she brought to all things, clear-eyed and unhedged and completely true. "I think I have been moving toward that for most of this year, and I thought you should know it directly, without any more patience around it." Matthew Warren stood in the yard of the Baker farm in the September sun and felt the thing he had recognized in April and been carrying since then arrive, fully and completely, at its destination. "I love you too," he said. "I have for some time." She looked at him with those direct green eyes, and then he closed the remaining space between them and he kissed her, and she kissed him back. And it was not the careful, measured thing they had both been for so long. It was the thing underneath the care and the measure, the thing that had been building since an October courthouse and a February fire and a spring irrigation channel. It was the whole year of it arriving all at once. When they separated, she was smiling, and this time she did not pull it back. "I should tell you," he said, still close enough that speaking was quiet, "that I intend to ask you to marry me, and I am not going to do it right now because I want to do it properly, and the ruling came today and we are both still absorbing it, but I want you to know it is coming. I want you to know," she said, "that the answer will be yes." He did do it properly. He came to the Baker farm 2 weeks later on a clear October evening that was precisely 1 year after the water rights hearing, and he asked her on the porch steps with the stars beginning to show over the Rio Seco in the darkening sky. And she said yes in the same clear, unhedged way she had said she loved him, and he put on her finger a ring that had been his mother's, which Maria Reyes had retrieved from the household valuables with visible satisfaction at being asked. Daniel Baker shook Matthew's hand, and then pulled him into an embrace that was the embrace of a younger brother who had been watching his older sister carry something alone for a long time, and was very glad she did not have to anymore. They were married in December of 1883 at the Dry Creek Methodist Church, in a ceremony that the entire community attended with the particular investment of people whose own lives and conflicts had been woven into the story of these two people arriving at this place. Hector and Maria Reyes sat in the front row on the groom's side. Ruth Cummer attended with Eliza Aldridge, who wore a new dress that Matthew had arranged for and who sat very straight in the church pew with the serious attention she brought to everything. The preacher said the words. Matthew said them back. Catherine said them back, steady-voiced and sure, looking at him with eyes that held everything the year had been and everything it was pointing toward. Gerald Holt did not attend. This was universally understood to be his loss. After the ceremony, at the church hall supper that was in every practical way the descendant of the church supper 15 months earlier, where the whole thing had begun, Matthew danced with his wife to a fiddle player whose name he would never quite catch, and she danced with the ease of someone who had, finally, put down a weight she had been carrying for a very long time. And the combination of her in his arms and the warmth of the room and the particular music of a community celebrating something that had resolved correctly was, he decided, the finest thing he had ever been part of. They moved Catherine into the Warren Ranch house in January of 1884, and this produced an adjustment period that was, by the standards of the adjustments both of them had been through, relatively manageable. The ranch house was large enough that two people with strong, individual approaches to nearly everything had room to be themselves inside it, and Catherine took to the management of the larger household operation with the same systematic competence she had brought to the water rights case, which produced, within 3 months, a set of organizational improvements that Maria Reyes openly endorsed, and that Matthew accepted with the cheerful surrender of a man who has learned that his instinct to defer to Catherine Baker's systems is generally an excellent instinct. Daniel Baker managed the Baker farm, which Catherine retained. She was not a woman who parted with what she had built, and Matthew had not suggested she should. The Baker farm operated as it had, as a going concern, with Daniel increasingly independent and increasingly successful, the irrigation channel running well and the wheat field returning solid harvests. The Rio Seco Smallholder Association continued under Catherine's leadership, though the urgency of the legal fight was behind them now, and the association's work shifted toward the more ordinary and more sustainable work of shared resource management and collective problem-solving that Catherine had always intended it to become. She wrote up the association's methods and submitted the document to the New Mexico Territorial Agricultural Commissioner, who published it as a model for similar organizations in the territory. She received a letter of commendation from the commissioner's office, which she framed and hung in the Baker farm front room rather than the Warren Ranch, on the grounds that it belonged to the place where the work had been done. In the spring of 1884, something changed at the Warren Ranch in a way that produced a particular morning when Matthew came downstairs to find Catherine sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a specific expression that he had not seen before and immediately recognized anyway. "You're certain," he said. "Dr. Whitfield was in Dry Creek yesterday," she said. "Yes." He sat down across from her and took her hands across the table, and they were both quiet for a moment with this large, new thing between them. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was the same question Daniel had asked her after the ruling, and she remembered it and she smiled. "More than happy," she said, "though complex, yes." Their son was born in November of 1884. They named him William James Warren, William for Catherine's father and James for Matthew's, which was the kind of thing that seemed to both of them a correct way of acknowledging that the people who had made them were real, complicated, irreplaceable, and not entirely separated from who their children would become. William arrived with dark hair and his mother's green eyes, and a decided opinion about the world from approximately his first hour in it, which surprised no one who knew either of his parents. Eliza Aldridge was 19 when William was born, and she came to the ranch house to see the baby with the self-possession of a young woman who had been quietly shaped, over several years, by access to education and material security, and the knowledge that she had not been forgotten. She held William with careful, practiced competence, and told Catherine that he had a look about him that suggested he would be trouble. "He comes by it honestly," Catherine said. Matthew, sitting in the corner of the room with the particular satisfaction of a man whose life has come to contain things he had not known to want, laughed at this, and the sound of it filled the room in the way that laughter does in a room full of people who are, genuinely and completely, at home. The following years built themselves with the honest, day-by-day solidity of lives well constructed. The Warren Ranch adapted to the modified water rights, which required changes in grazing patterns and some shifts in the ranch's primary income streams. But Matthew found that the adaptation produced, unexpectedly, a more efficient and sustainable operation than the old arrangement had been. He hired a ranch hand who had experience with smaller-scale irrigation agriculture, and over time the Warren Ranch began operating portions of its land as irrigated cropland in addition to rangeland, a hybrid model that was unusual in Dry Creek County, and that turned out to be considerably more resilient in dry years. Catherine continued her work with the Smallholder Association, while managing the domestic life of the Warren Ranch with the focused competence that characterized everything she did, which was to say that she did not manage the domestic life of the Warren Ranch at all, in the sense of making it her primary occupation, but in the sense of ensuring it ran correctly while she also did everything else. Maria Reyes, who remained essential to the household, observed to Hector once that Mrs. Warren was the most efficient person she had ever known, which was high praise from Maria, who was herself formidably efficient. A daughter arrived in 1886, a small, imperious person they named Alina Ruth, Ruth for Ruth Cummer, who had cried when they told her this in a way that suggested she had not been cried over often enough. Alina was from the beginning absolutely unlike William in every way that was not, at the center, a deep stubbornness that they had both apparently inherited, and that made for lively dinners as the children grew. Matthew and Catherine's marriage had the quality of a thing that had been built rather than simply found, and because it had been built, it had the solidity of something constructed by two skilled people who knew what they were doing. There were arguments, because two people with strongly held positions and clear ways of seeing the world will have arguments, and some of the arguments were about things that mattered. The ranch's legal strategy when a neighboring rancher tried to relitigate a water rights boundary in 1887, the appropriate balance between the ranch's expansion ambitions and the community water table management plan Catherine was developing with the Territorial Commission. They argued these things with the same directness and precision they brought to everything, and they resolved them the same way, by listening, by using actual evidence, by the specific discipline of two people who have promised each other that the goal is always the truth of the matter rather than the victory. There was also, consistently and deeply, the other thing, the thing that had begun with green eyes across a courthouse corridor, and had deepened through every February night and Sunday afternoon and July porch step and September yard. The specific pleasure of being known, completely and without management, by the person you have chosen to stand in your life with. The way Catherine would look up from her desk when he came into a room with the immediate focus that was also acknowledgement. The way she knew from the set of his shoulders when something had gone wrong at the ranch before he said a word. The way he knew from the particular quality of her silence, whether she was thinking through a problem or needed to be left alone or needed, without wanting to ask for it, someone to sit next to. They built things together with the patient, unhurried confidence of people who know they have time. A better irrigation system for the Baker farm, designed by Matthew based on Catherine's specifications. A small library for the Dry Creek schoolhouse, funded by a donation from the Warren Ranch, an initiative Catherine had proposed, and Matthew had pursued with the specific interest of someone who had been thinking about Eliza Aldridge and all the children like her for years. A legal template for water rights protection that Catherine drafted in 1888 and submitted to the territorial legislature, which eventually formed the basis of a territorial statute that would protect smallholder water access across New Mexico for the next several decades. Eliza Aldridge went to a teacher's college in Albuquerque in 1890, funded by a scholarship that was, technically, endowed by the Warren Ranch's charitable fund and administered by Catherine, and she came back to Dry Creek 3 years later as a qualified schoolteacher and took a position at the very schoolhouse where the new library had been installed. She was steady and serious and genuinely gifted at teaching, and she taught in Dry Creek County for 30 years, and the first generation of students who passed through her classroom included William Warren, who was 9 years old when she began and who regarded Mrs. Aldridge with a mixture of respect and healthy wariness that she had cultivated deliberately and justifiably. In 1891, a third child came to the Warren household, another son, who arrived in the early spring and was named Thomas Daniel Warren, Thomas for his absent namesake and Daniel for the uncle who had ridden 20 miles in the rain when he heard the news and arrived at the ranch house door with his hat dripping and a face full of emotion that he managed with varying success. Thomas was quieter than his brother and sister, a thoughtful child who spent more time watching and listening than either William or Alina, and who seemed from early on to have inherited his mother's quality of patience and his father's quality of wanting to understand how things actually worked. The Warren Ranch, by 1892, was a different thing than the ranch Matthew had inherited in 1877. It was smaller in some ways, its water rights claim permanently modified, its land use more varied than pure rangeland, its relationship to the surrounding small farms not the adversarial extraction that James Warren had built, but something more like the interdependent system that Catherine had always argued the river valley was in reality. It was also, in important ways, more secure. Because it had stopped trying to take more than the land and water could sustainably give, it had stopped being the kind of operation that was always one bad decision or one wet season away from collapse. Matthew had understood this as a concept when Catherine had first laid it out for him, in pieces, over the year following the hearing. He understood it now as a lived thing, in his body, in the soil under his boots, in the ranch accounts that showed 15 years of modified practice producing something durable in the place of something merely large. He was 42 in 1892, and he was the kind of man he had wanted to become, which was a thing he thought about on certain mornings, when the light came in through the ranch house windows and Catherine was still asleep beside him, and the land outside was quiet and lit, and entirely itself. He had not known, at 27, when he inherited the ranch and the diversion rights and the legal arrangement and the whole apparatus of the life his father had built, that this was possible. He had not known that you could choose differently than what you had been handed. He had learned this from a woman who had walked into a courthouse after him, with a leather satchel and green eyes and 45 minutes of documentary evidence, and had taken nothing from him that was not, by any honest accounting, already owed. In the summer of 1893, they rode together along the full length of the Rio Seco tributary from its mountain source to where it joined the larger drainage to the south, the two of them on horseback over 3 days, camping by the water at night, passing through every farm and ranch along the way. It was something Catherine had proposed as a kind of accounting, a way of seeing the whole system they had spent a decade helping to reshape, all at once, in its actual physical reality. They stopped at every farm. They drank coffee at 6 different kitchen tables. They saw irrigation channels that were running clean and full. They saw wheat and corn and kitchen gardens that were producing well. They saw Thomas Aldridge's old farm, which had a new family on it now. A young couple from Colorado who had bought the land in 1886 and who knew nothing of its history but were making something of it, and who received them cheerfully and fed them biscuits and asked about water management with the genuine interest of people who had figured out that Catherine Baker Warren was a person worth asking. On the last night of the ride, they camped beside the river where it widened into a small, still pool before the slope toward the southern drainage. The evening was warm and the stars over the New Mexico territory were the particular overwhelming abundance of stars that you only get far from town, and they sat beside the fire after supper with the sound of the water close and the horses quiet in the dark behind them. "I keep thinking about what it looked like before," Matthew said. He meant the water allocation, the dry downstream farms, the whole arrangement his father had built. "I know," Catherine said. "I keep thinking about how long it went on, and how normal it seemed, and how many people were harmed who just accepted it because it was the arrangement." "Yes." She was looking at the fire, then she looked up at the stars, then she looked at him. "But then you think about what it is now." "Yes. And you think about what it will be in 30 years when our children are managing it and their children after them." "Thomas will manage it correctly," he said, with the certainty of a man who has watched his quiet, thoughtful youngest child pay attention to everything for 2 years. "He sees the whole system. He thinks about it the way you do." She smiled. "Eleanor will fight for it." "Yes," he said and grinned. "God help anyone who tries to argue property law with Eleanor." "And William," she said, "will charm everyone who gets in his way in close deals they don't know they've made until it's over." "He is terrifyingly effective for 9 years old," Matthew agreed. They were quiet for a while, and the fire moved and the river moved and the stars above the territory moved through their slow, enormous arc. "I want to tell you something," Catherine said. He looked at her. "I want to tell you that every part of this," she gestured, and the gesture encompassed the fire and the river and the 10 years and the children and the ranch and all of it, "is something I did not let myself want until I had won it fairly. I thought for a long time that was the right approach. That wanting something before you had earned the right to it was a kind of weakness. And now I think that winning things fairly is important, and also that waiting to want what you want until you have earned it is a very lonely way to live." She turned to him fully. "I am glad I stopped waiting." He reached over and put his hand against the side of her face, and she leaned into it with the ease of a person entirely at home in where they are. "I am glad you are relentless," he said. "I am glad you carried all of that evidence into that courthouse, and I am glad you were patient when I was still becoming the person who deserved to be in the same room with you, and I am glad that a wheel broke in February and put you on my road." "It was my road too," she pointed out. "It was your road too," he agreed. "That is always true." She moved closer, and he put his arm around her and she leaned against him, and they sat that way by the fire on the last night of the Rio Seco ride, with the water running past them and the stars overhead, and the land all around them holding everything they had planted in it. All the careful, persistent, long-tended things that had grown up from a courthouse hearing, and a frozen road, and a year of Sunday afternoons into a life that was, by any honest accounting, exactly what it should be. The drive back to the Warren Ranch took most of the next day, and they arrived in the late afternoon to find William and Eleanor and Thomas in the yard in states of varying mud and occupation, being supervised by Daniel Baker, who had come to check on the farm, and stayed to supervise his niece and nephews with the easy authority of a beloved uncle who was not above being climbed on. Eleanor ran to her mother and was swung up onto Catherine's hip with the ease of long practice. Thomas came to his father's knee with the deliberate, measuring approach he brought to all things. William announced loudly that Daniel had let him help with the feed and that he had done it correctly and asked if anyone wanted to hear about it. "Tell me at supper," Catherine said, setting Eleanor down and beginning to move toward the house with the efficient, purposeful stride that had always made people instinctively move out of her way. Matthew stood in the yard for a moment with the ranch spread out around him in the afternoon light, the house and the barn and the irrigated fields to the east and the grassland to the west, and the Rio Seco somewhere beyond the far fence line carrying its water through all the land it kept alive. And he thought about a courthouse in October of 1882, and a woman who had walked in after him and won, and who had, in doing so, given him the only thing more valuable than the water rights he had lost. She had given him the chance to become the person he was supposed to be, and the life that person was supposed to have. He followed his family into the house. In the years that followed, the Warren Ranch and the Baker Farm became something that was spoken of throughout the territory as a model of what water resource cooperation could look like, though neither Matthew nor Catherine ever described it in those terms. They described it as neighbors getting things right, which was what it was, and which was, they both knew, simultaneously the simplest and the hardest thing in the world to do. The New Mexico territorial statute, that Catherine's 1888 template, had helped produce protected smallholder water rights across the territory, and was cited in several subsequent legal cases as foundational. Theodore Marsh, the civil servant in Santa Fe who had eventually processed Catherine's federal complaint, was promoted twice and retired in 1901 with a commendation for his department's handling of water resource policy, a commendation he received with the complex equanimity of a man who knows that the significant work had been done by someone else. Eliza Aldridge taught in Dry Creek until 1920 and produced, by her own reckoning, 4 generations of students who knew something about water systems and property rights and the responsibilities that came with both. She never forgot that a man named Matthew Warren had sat at her aunt's kitchen table 3 times in the spring of 1883 and answered her questions directly, and she told this story to her students as an example of what accountability looked like in practice rather than in principle. Daniel Baker married a woman named Clara from the neighboring county in 1886, and the Baker farm stayed in the family and produced steady harvests for the next 3 decades. Daniel and Clara had 4 children, and Catherine was the kind of aunt who arrived at a Baker farm birthday with exactly the present that was wanted, and then sat at the table and argued agricultural theory with Daniel over supper until Clara sent everyone to bed. Gerald Holt's ranch, which had operated on the same upstream extraction principles as the Warren Ranch and which had not voluntarily modified anything, ran into escalating legal difficulties throughout the 1890s and was sold in pieces by 1905. The sale proceeded in a way that Gerald Holt found unsatisfying, which was generally agreed by those who knew the full history to be accurate and appropriate. Ruth Cummer lived until 1897 and died in the house on the edge of Dry Creek that was, by then, considerably better appointed than when Matthew had first visited it. A small, steady improvement that had happened in the same patient, practical way that Catherine Baker applied to all things. At Ruth's funeral, Catherine sat with Eliza and held her hand through the service, and Matthew sat on Eliza's other side, and the 3 of them were the first to stand and the last to leave. William Warren grew up to be exactly the person his parents had predicted, which was to say a person of considerable charm and considerable effectiveness, who could close a deal before anyone understood a deal was on offer. He took over the Warren Ranch's business operations at 25 and ran them with an energy and creativity that both surprised and pleased Matthew, who watched his eldest son operate and recognized in him both the sharpest parts of himself and the best parts of Catherine, recombined by the specific alchemy of a different generation into something entirely new. Eleanor Warren became a lawyer. This also surprised no one. She studied law in Albuquerque and practiced in Santa Fe, where she spent 30 years arguing property and water rights cases with the combined force of her mother's systematic documentation and her father's unnerving ability to stay in a room until the room agreed with him. She was mentioned in 3 legal histories of New Mexico water law and disputed all 3 accounts on the grounds that they simplified things she considered important to understand in their full complexity. Thomas Warren stayed closest to the land. He managed the agricultural side of the Warren Ranch with a combination of his mother's patience and his father's practical intelligence that produced, over the decades, exactly the sustainable operation that the modified water rights had been designed to create. He was also the one who, late in his life, wrote down the history of the Rio Seco water rights case in a careful, detailed account that sat in the Dry Creek County Record's office and was read by local historians for generations afterward. He dedicated it to Thomas Aldridge, who had come to a ranch house door twice in the winter of 1878 and had been met the second time by a lawyer. Matthew and Catherine grew old in the ranch house on the Warren land, and the growing old was the kind that happens when 2 people have built something real together. It did not make the essential things smaller but larger, the particular intimacy of long shared history, the language that develops between two people who have known each other through everything, the quality of presence that fills a house when the person in it is the right person. They had 37 years together from the December wedding in the Dry Creek Methodist Church. They traveled some, to Santa Fe and to Albuquerque, and once to Denver, where they attended a conference on territorial water management at which Catherine spoke and Matthew sat in the front row with the expression of a man watching something magnificent and being aware that he is watching it. They came home always to the ranch house and the Rio Seco and the land that had been the center of the story from the beginning. On a spring morning in 1920, Matthew Warren sat on the porch of the ranch house with a cup of coffee and watched the light come up over the eastern fields, where Thomas's irrigation system was already running and the early crops were showing green against the red soil. And Catherine came out and sat beside him with her own cup, and they sat together in the early warmth with the sounds of the working ranch beginning to emerge around them. A horse in the barn, a door somewhere. The birds in the cottonwoods by the river. She had gray in her hair now, both of them had gray, and the lines in their faces were the lines of weather and feeling and attention, the lines of people who had been fully present for a long life. She was 66 years old. She was, by any measure that meant anything, more herself than she had been at 28, the essential Catherine distilled by decades into something finer and more complete. "Are you happy?" he asked, because it was a question he had never stopped wanting to know the answer to, and because her answers were always interesting. She looked at the fields and the sky and the cottonwoods by the river, and then she looked at him with the direct green eyes that had looked at him across 37 years of everything. "Completely," she said. He took her hand, the same hand he had taken on a porch step in July of 1883, and she curled her fingers around his with the easy certainty of someone for whom this gesture had become as natural as breathing. The Rio Seco ran through the morning. The fields were green. The three children were somewhere in the world being themselves, which was everything a parent could reasonably want. Eliza Aldridge was at that moment preparing a lesson about the water cycle for a classroom of 12-year-olds who would grow up knowing what their water came from and who had fought for it. The land held everything that had been planted in it. The morning was entirely itself. And Matthew Warren and Catherine Baker Warren sat together on the porch of the home they had built, in the full knowledge that the life they had made was exactly what the best version of both of them had always been capable of, and they were, in every way that truth could measure, home.